part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome back to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. I am your host, Ben Billman, and I hope you all had a great Christmas and are off to a great start here in the year 2024. So we, at this point in the college basketball season, have moved on from the non-conference schedule, and now for the most part, we are in the conference schedule. So in the first half of today's episode, I want to go over what's new in the top 25, and then also take a look at the Mountain West Conference, maybe one of those conferences that is slept on a little bit when it comes to overall national success and trending when it comes to discussion on major networks. So I want to give them a little bit of love and look at how they compare with other power conferences in the NCAA. And then in the second half today, I'm going to go through conference by conference and select who I think is going to be the regular season champion in each of those conferences. There are 32 conferences in the NCAA Division I. Each one gets an automatic bid to the national tournament based on who wins the conference tournament. But today I'll be predicting who I think will be the number one seed in each of those conferences heading in to the conference tournaments. So I look forward to talking about that a little more in the second half of this episode. But let me start with the current top 25. The first three teams, Purdue, Kansas, and Houston, remain unchanged. And really, I think those are correct in the ranking and the order that they're placed in. There were a lot of teams that moved up one spot, but there are three teams that fell drastically over this past week. First of all, Arizona, who dropped all the way down to number 10. It was a drop of 6 spots. And Arizona in recent weeks has just not been playing very well. They're only 3-3 in their last 6 games. They've lost to Purdue, to Florida Atlantic, and to Stanford at Stanford by 18. Which is just not a good loss if you're looking to win the Pac-12. So Arizona has definitely dropped off a little bit. They are still 2-1 in the Pac-12. I still feel confident that they're going to win that conference, but you have to be a little bit nervous now if you're the Pac-12 overall. If your best team is in a little bit of a slump right now, what that will mean for seeding in the NCAA tournament. Another team that dropped drastically is Florida Atlantic. Now, in the last episode of the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast, I focused and centered a lot about Florida Atlantic and the chances that they had of potentially grabbing a number one seed in the NCAA tournament. But it looks like that dream died very quickly when they lost a tough game, a close game, but they still lost to Florida Gulf Coast by 4. It was at Florida Gulf Coast, but still a loss of that magnitude is just not going to sit well in the committee's eyes on Selection Sunday. I think Florida Atlantic is out of the discussion of a number one seed. And because of that loss, they dropped all the way from number 7, and now they are all the way down at number 17 in the top 25. And then the final team that I want to mention that had a pretty drastic drop, but somehow was able to stay in the top 25 was Gonzaga. Gonzaga sits at number 24 right now, dropping 11 places over the past week, and that was due to a loss to San Diego State. I will talk a little bit more about San Diego State here in a couple minutes when I talk about the Mountain West Conference, but definitely a sign of concern for Gonzaga. Losing by 10 at home, that gives them 4 non-conference losses, and along with Florida Atlantic, I think Gonzaga is a team that really has no chance at a number 1 seed anymore. And really, when it comes to the West Coast Conference, you really have to question what their dominance is going to look like. Now, they did get their first conference win in their first conference game. This past week, they beat Pepperdine by 26, so that's a good sign. But the rest of the schedule, I'm not sure what's going to happen with Gonzaga. Those were 3 teams that dropped pretty drastically: Arizona, Florida Atlantic, and Gonzaga. And on the outside looking in, but teams that I expect or imagine will be in the top 25 fairly soon. First of all, San Diego State. Like I mentioned, they did beat Gonzaga. And here in a couple minutes when I talk about the Mountain West, I will mention them again. Another team that I think a lot of people had written off, but now all of a sudden they have some momentum going, is Michigan State. And there is definitely a possibility in the Big Ten for Michigan State all of a sudden to be at the top of that conference. So keep an eye on them as well. And then another team that I would keep an eye on is Texas A&M. Very similar to Michigan State. They got off to kind of a bad start overall during the season, but they have definitely come back around, and I think they are in a good position going into the SEC schedule to do some really special things moving forward. All right, so looking at some of the big games coming up, Saturday is loaded with good conference games, and it's going to be the first chance that we'll see when the teams start playing against other teams that they see at least 2 or maybe 3 times every year. Nothing is going to surprise these teams, and home court advantage is going to play a huge part in where these games go. So if you're a college basketball fan, this Saturday is going to be very exciting. First of all, at 12 o'clock, North Carolina plays at Clemson. Clemson just lost to Miami, so a little bit of their momentum is gone. But they have a real chance here at home against a top 10 team in North Carolina to make an early statement in the Atlantic Coast Conference that they are a team to be dealt with and potentially playing for a conference championship. Another big game, Florida plays Kentucky at Florida. Kentucky is one of my 2 favorites in the Southeastern Conference, but Florida is a very tough place to play and has given Kentucky problems in recent years. So keep an eye on that game. Kansas plays TCU at Kansas, number 2 in the country. TCU is currently unranked, but they are 11-2 on the year. And in the Big 12, every single game is going to be an absolute battle. Another big game is Creighton versus Providence at Creighton. Now, Creighton has fallen out of the top 25 in recent weeks. A win over Providence would go a long way towards getting them back into that top 25 and into the upper tier of the Big East. Tennessee will play host to Mississippi on Saturday. Tennessee number 5, Mississippi number 22. Mississippi is one of only 3 undefeated teams left in all of Division I. Chris Beard, again in his first year there, has done an amazing job, and sitting at number 22, a win over Tennessee would move them from a category of what do they really have, what do we really know about them, to a major contender in the conference and a team to watch out for in March. And then finally, BYU at home against Cincinnati. These are 2 new additions to the Big 12 this year, both playing in their first conference game of their program's history in the Big 12. BYU currently sits at number 12. Cincinnati is unranked, but they are 11-2 on the year. That is a late game. It doesn't start till 10 o'clock on Saturday, but it's one to keep an eye on. to see how those teams challenge in the Big 12, especially with Houston at the top, another new team, and Central Florida. Those are the 4 new schools in the Big 12. That will be fascinating. And then on Sunday, there's one game that is on ESPN at 5 o'clock that I think will be very interesting to watch, and that is Memphis hosting SMU. Again, Memphis right now is 15th in the country at 12-2, and they have a really good shot at improving as they move through conference play. SMU sits at 10-4 and could give Memphis a challenge. Again, Memphis playing in the American Athletic Conference. This could be their year to win that conference championship with Houston gone and Cincinnati gone. Memphis could take a big jump, and I would put them in the discussion for a top 2 or 3 seed if they do win that conference. So those are some games to keep an eye on this weekend. Should be a lot of fun, and the conference schedule is always appealing. Don't be too worried if your team loses a game or two early. In some of these major conferences, just going 500, whether it's 9-9 or 10-10, is usually good enough to get your team into the NCAA tournament as long as the strength of schedule is there for the conference overall. Okay, so that's a little bit of look at the top 25, where teams stand right now, and some of the trends moving forward and some of the games that are happening this weekend. But now I want to turn my focus a little bit more to the Mountain West Conference. Now, nationally, most of the people that follow college basketball refer to the Power Six conferences, as those that are at the top of the heap when it comes to the depth of the teams in the conference, the success overall, and when it comes to the committee, the conferences that are not just getting 2 or 3 bids into the NCAA tournament, but 4, 5, 6, 7. I have even seen some conferences get as many as 9 or 10 in the NCAA tournament. So when I'm talking about the Power Six, that includes the SEC, the Big East, the Big 12, the Big 10, the Pac-12, and the ACC. Those would be the Power Six. But there is one conference sitting right outside of that Power Six that definitely needs to be talked about, because this year that conference might actually be better than some of the Power Six conferences, and that is the Mountain West Conference. Now, at this point of the season, yes, the top 25 is helpful in determining the rankings and the overall quality of teams, but it is starting to be time to look at some of the power rankings as well as some of the computer statistics to figure out how good these teams are. Now, in the world of college basketball, Ken Pomeroy is kind of the one name that sticks out with his Ken Pom rankings. He brings those out daily to discuss which teams are the best, and those play a huge part in the rankings when it comes to March and the NCAA tournament. I really like the Ken Pom rankings. I look at them almost every day. But in my eyes, and maybe I'm a little bit biased here, but the Ken Massey ratings are what I look at when it comes to college basketball and the statistical model. One of the reasons I'm probably biased is because Dr. Massey also teaches at the school that I do, Carson Newman. I see him on a regular basis and talk to him every so often. And so I know, for the most part, how he does his rankings and what goes into them. So moving forward the rest of this year, when I talk about the Massey ratings, those are very similar to the Ken Pom rankings, and a lot of the time they're duplicate or they overlap very well. But if you're looking for a more accurate picture of where these teams stand going into March, you really do have to look at these statistical models and not just at the top 25. So having said all of that, looking at the Massey ratings for the Mountain West Conference, there are 5 teams right now in the top 50 of the Massey ratings from the Mountain West Conference. We have San Diego State at number 16, Utah State at number 18, Colorado State at number 28, Nevada at number 31, and New Mexico at number 48. So as of right now, every single one of those teams, if I were putting together a bracket for March Madness, would be in the field of 68. And the other thing to consider about these 5 teams is that between all 5 of these teams so far, they only have a total of 7 losses combined, which is very impressive. Now, the only problem with the Mountain West Conference right now is that, yes, you have these 5 teams. Boise State is a little bit below these teams, but beyond that, it does fall off a cliff pretty quickly. But I would put these 5 teams up against almost any conference in the country, and I do think that the Mountain West Conference, at least at the top, is better than a couple of those Power 6 conferences. Again, we've seen San Diego State in recent years have tournament success. Nevada went to the Sweet 16 a couple years ago, and Utah State, Colorado State, and New Mexico are teams that you do not want to mess with in March. So if there were 2 of the 6 power conferences that I look at and say, if we were going to have a conference battle between the Mountain West and one of these 2 conferences, it wouldn't surprise me if the Mountain West won. The SEC, the Big East, the Big 12, and the Big 10 are just too tough top to bottom. They have too much depth as far as teams go. The top of the conference is too good. And even when you get down to the 9th, the 10th, the 11th best teams, still have really good quality of play. And you're going to see a high amount of teams from those conferences make it to the tournament. But I do think there are 2 conferences in the Power 6 that the Mountain West, at least the top of the Mountain West, is better than. First of all, I think the Pac-12. As I mentioned earlier, Arizona has taken a drop in the standings in recent weeks. They sit at number 5 still in the Massey ratings. But below that, you have to go all the way down to 26 to find Utah, Colorado at 36, and Oregon at 42. And beyond that, the Pac-12 drops off pretty drastically. Again, if the tournament started today, I think Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Oregon would get in, but I don't think they'd be any higher in the seedings than the Mountain West Conference, especially San Diego State and Utah State. And so therefore, I think if you put the top 5 Mountain West against the top 5 Pac-12 right now, I think the Mountain West wins that. Arizona might be the only team that I look at and say that that's the most dominant team in those conferences, but even right now with Arizona, I'm not sure about that. And then the other conference that I have real questions about, and I think the Mountain West, again, matches up pretty well against them, is the ACC. And that is pretty shocking because when you look at the history of the ACC and national champions over time, especially with Duke and North Carolina, and then you see Virginia who won it in 2019, you would say that the ACC, there's just no way that the Mountain West Conference can compete against the ACC. But this year is a little bit different because there is no real dominant team right now in the ACC. They do have 3 teams that fall in the top 5 or the top 15 of the Massey ratings, and that's North Carolina at number 11, Clemson at number 14, and Duke at number 15. But beyond that, you have to go all the way down to 30, where you see Miami, and then also 38, where there's Virginia. And I have major questions about 4 of these 5 teams. I think North Carolina is the only one that I feel pretty secure about being there at the top the whole season. But Clemson, Duke, Miami, and Virginia still trying to find themselves, and I'm not very confident with them going into conference play how they are going to do. So looking at the ACC, even though that conference does have more depth than the Mountain West Conference, I think at the top you could make a real argument that the Mountain West Conference is right there as far as the top 4 or 5 as the ACC. So going into conference play, keep an eye on the Mountain West Conference. They may not be considered a Power 6 conference, but this year they may get 5 or maybe even 6 teams in the NCAA tournament. And based on San Diego State's success last year, making it all the way to the national championship game, it wouldn't surprise me to see some of these teams make it to the second round, the Sweet 16, or beyond. So I wanted to give a shout out to the Mountain West Conference. We cannot forget about them as we move forward. And the last note is, as the Pac-12 dissolves after this year, the Mountain West Conference will really be on the West Coast, the conference at the top. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people move them up into that Power 6, Power 5 category if they have a lot of tournament success this year. All right, let's take a quick break for some advertisements, and then we'll be back for the second half.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
What's up, everyone? I'm Holly Wetzel.
And I'm Tybus Powell.
And we are your hosts of The Orange is Oranger, a Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. We give you all the dog pound coverage that you'll need to get you through the regular season, hopeful postseason, and I'd say off-season, Tybus, but is there really ever an off-season for this team?
Thankfully for our podcast, Holly, there really never is when it comes to the Cleveland Browns. Don't miss our breakdown of each week's matchup, game recaps, and any and all news out of Berea to feed your Browns appetite. As we know, Holly, dogs gotta eat.
Yes, they do. So hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of the Orange is Oranger, Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network.
All right, welcome back to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast for the second half. And I'm looking forward to the second half of this one. We are now transitioning in college basketball from the non-conference season and going full swing into conference play. As a reminder, there are 32 conferences in the NCAA Division I, and one of those teams, or one team from each of those conferences, will make it as an automatic bid to the NCAA tournament. So I'm going to go through and choose who I think has the best chance of winning the regular season in each of those conferences, and therefore would have the best chance heading into the conference tournaments to get that automatic bid to the NCAA. So I have these conferences, all 32 of them, categorized based on the quality of the conferences and the chances that they have of getting multiple bids into the NCAA tournament. The first category that I'm going to look at is those conferences that no matter what happens, no matter who wins the conference, no matter how well they do, only one school is going to make it from those conferences. And in that category of the 32 conferences, I have 18 of them in that first category. The second category, category number 2, is conferences that have one dominant team. And if that team did not win the conference tournament, it is possible that the automatic bid plus that dominant team could get in as an at-large. And in that category, there are 7 conferences and really 7 teams in each of those conferences that even if they did not get the automatic bid, I think they would still have a chance to be on the bubble and get in on Selection Sunday. And then finally, there are 7 conferences where no matter what happens, there are going to be multiple bids from that conference. So yes, winning a regular season championship or a conference tournament championship would be awesome. Even if a team does not do either of those, there's still a good chance that they can get in to the NCAA tournament with an at-large bid. And most years, a high majority of those at-large bids come from those 7 conferences that I will discuss later on in the second half. But first of all, going back to Category 1, the 18 conferences where it's one team and one team only, no matter what happens. I want to run through those fairly quickly. I know some of you might follow these conferences closer than others. Some of you might recognize some of these schools based on previous success or previous tournament appearances. But again, most of these schools, when they get into the NCAA tournament, are going to be either 14, 15, or 16 seeds, and rarely do they make any noise in the NCAA tournament other than a team here or there that pulls a major upset. So of those 18 conferences, first of all, in the SWAC, I have Southern University. In the Northeast Conference, I have Fairleigh Dickinson. And again, this is one of those teams that had recent success by beating Purdue, only the second number 16 seed ever to beat a number 1 seed. And I think they win the Northeast regular season title. In the MEAC, I have Norfolk State. In the Patriot League, I have Colgate. In the Southland, I have McNeese State. Now, McNeese State might be the hardest team for me to put on this list because of who their head coach is. Will Wade was the coach at Louisiana State University, LSU, up until 2 years ago when he got fired. The reason for that firing was because of recruiting violations that were pretty self-explanatory. LSU 1 year or 2 years into Will Wade's tenure there went from just an average recruiting school to having the number 1 recruiting class overall in the span of just 1 year. And where there's smoke, there's fire, and there was definitely fire there when Will Wade was at LSU. The NCAA investigated, proved that, yes, he had violated recruiting procedures, and it took a while for him to get fired, but eventually he did. Well, now he's at McNeese State in his first year. He has a really good team. Again, it pains me to say that, and it wouldn't surprise me to see them win the Southland Conference. Moving on through these one-bid conferences, the Ohio Valley, I have Morehead State. In the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference, I have Iona. In the Atlantic Sun, I have Lipscomb. In the Horizon, Purdue-Fort Wayne. In the Summit League, South Dakota State. In the America East, the team that always seems to come out of this conference, Vermont. In the Big South, UNC Asheville. In the Big Sky, Weber State, the home of Damian Lillard. In the MAC, I have Akron. In the Colonial, Charleston. In the SoCon, or the Southern Conference, I have Samford. In the Big West, I have UC Irvine. And in Conference USA, I have Liberty. Okay, so those are 18 schools and 18 conferences where there's only one bid guaranteed for those conferences. And so if any of those teams that I just listed off did not win the conference championship, it's unfortunate, but we will not see them in the NCAA tournament. Okay, now for Category 2. Like I mentioned, these are conferences where as of right now there is one team that is definitely at the top. But if that team does not win the conference tournament, I still think they have a chance to get in, which would mean that these conferences could be 2-bid conferences on Selection Sunday. Okay, so the first school, or the first conference that I have in this list of 7 would be the Ivy League. And with the Ivy League, I have Princeton as the favorite to win the regular season championship. Last year, they made the Sweet 16. They return a lot of talent from last year. They're sitting at 12-1 right now, and I think they are the class of the Ivy League. If there was one school, though, well, there's multiple schools in the Ivy League, but if I had to choose one that looks like they are right on their tail, it would be Harvard, who has also had recent tournament success and multiple bids in recent years. So, for instance, if Harvard were to win the Ivy League, I think Princeton still has a chance to get in as an at-large. Now, they would probably need to sweep through the Ivy League without losing a game, But if they were able to do that, it wouldn't surprise me to see them getting an at-large on Selection Sunday. Okay, the second conference would be the Sun Belt Conference. And right now, there are 3 teams that are undefeated in NCAA Division I, James Madison being one of those schools. Right now, they sit at 19th in the country, 14-0, and they are a member of the Sun Belt. I think James Madison, even if they do not win the Sun Belt because of their success this year, has the potential to get in as an at-large. And if there were one team that could potentially upset them, it would be Appalachian State in the Sun Belt. But as of right now, I still have James Madison being the regular season champion in the Sun Belt. Another conference of these 7 in Category 2 is the Western Athletic Conference. I have Grand Canyon winning this conference in the regular season. Right now, Grand Canyon is at 13-1. And if I were going to rank home court advantage in the NCAA, Grand Canyon is a top 10 or top 15 home court advantage in the nation. They have great student participation, a huge fan base, and they look like the class of the Western Athletic Conference. But if there were one school that I could see upsetting them, it would probably be Tarleton State. And if Tarleton State were somehow able to win the NCAA or the conference championship, tournament championship, I think Grand Canyon has a great chance to get in as an at-large. I've talked about Gonzaga before in the West Coast Conference, and I think they will win that conference. But if for some reason they don't, I still think Gonzaga will get an at-large bid. And the one team I could see that comes up and beats Gonzaga is San Francisco. St. Mary's is also another team that has done it in recent years, but I think San Francisco's a little bit better than St. Mary's this year. The Missouri Valley Conference. This is a conference that on occasion has gotten 2 teams in the NCAA tournament, and I think this year could be one of those years. As of right now, I have Drake as my favorite to win the Missouri Valley Conference. They look like a really solid team, and they've had recent success in the conference tournament and in the NCAA tournament overall. And I think Drake is a team, even if they were not to win the conference, I think they still have a chance at the NCAA tournament. And if there were one team in the Missouri Valley that I could see winning and upsetting Drake, it would be Indiana State, who is also off to a great start. And potentially, if they have success, could fall in that same category as Drake as an at-large bid. But right now I have the Drake winning that conference regular season. The American Athletic Conference. This conference has gone through some major changes over the last year and into this year, and I have Memphis as the winner of this conference regular season. Even if Memphis does not win the conference regular season or the conference tournament, I still feel very confident that they will be an at-large in the NCAA tournament. And if there was one team I could see rising up and winning that regular season, it would be Florida Atlantic. Now again, FAU just lost this past week to Florida Gulf Coast, but I still think they're a great team who, again, is also in the running for an at-large bid if they do not win the American Athletic Conference. And then finally, in the second category of conferences with one really good team and the potential for 2 possible bids on Selection Sunday would be the Atlantic 10. And right now I have Dayton as my favorite to win the conference regular season, but if I had to pick one other school that could challenge for that, it would be St. Bonaventure. I think Dayton, even if they don't win the conference, could have a major chance to make the championship or the tournament as an at-large seed. So keep an eye on those conferences. Okay, so those 7 conferences, the Ivy League, the Sun Belt, the WAC, the West Coast, Missouri Valley, the American, and the Atlantic 10. While they are not quite at the top of the standings, there is the possibility that we could see 2 teams come out of those leagues. And then finally, the 7 schools at the top. There's the Power 6 plus the Mountain West, as I discussed in the first half of the show, all 7 of these conferences will have multiple bids on Selection Sunday. Some of them it might be just 3 or 4, but some of them it could be upwards of 9 or 10, depending on how the conference regular season goes and the conference tournament. So again, looking at the Mountain West Conference, they have a handful of teams here at the top that I think have a good chance of winning. I'm going to pick Colorado State, though, as the team that I think comes out as the regular season champion in the Mountain West. If there's another team, though, that I had to choose in place of them, I think San Diego State would be that team. So those 2 teams overall, Colorado State and San Diego State, are the 2 that I'm looking at. I think the Mountain West, though, definitely has a possibility of getting 4 or 5 or maybe even 6 teams in the NCAA tournament this year, depending on how things go. Okay, in the Pac-12, right now the front runner is definitely Arizona. Arizona, even though they have struggled over the last couple of weeks, I still think that they are the team to beat in the Pac-12. They're still number 10 overall. They sit at 11-3. I really like this team, and I think they do win it. But if there is one team out there that could steal the thunder, win the regular season, and go into the conference tournament with the number 1 seed, it would be Oregon. Oregon is a well-coached team by Dana Altman. They've had recent success in the NCAA tournament. And so the Pac-12, even though Arizona I have winning, I do think that Oregon has a chance to upset them and play spoiler in the Pac-12. Overall, I think the Pac-12 will end up with 3 or 4 teams in the NCAA tournament, so they will, even though I don't think overall they're that strong, they will still be well represented when it comes to March Madness. Moving on to the Atlantic Coast Conference, at this point, I feel pretty confident that North Carolina is going to come out of the pack and win the regular season in this conference. But if not, I think Duke is probably the dark horse right now that has a great chance to be there if it is not North Carolina. Now, Duke has been off the radar in recent weeks because of a few early losses, but they are continually inching up in the rankings. Right now they sit at 14th. They're a real team to keep an eye on now that they're 10-3 and they enter into conference play in an ACC conference that they have really dominated over the past 20, 25 years. So they can never be counted out. And again, I think the ACC will end up with 5 or 6 bids in the NCAA tournament. The Big East, I have Connecticut winning the Big East. This will be one of the toughest challenges overall, though, when it comes to conference regular season championships. And if there's one team that I think could challenge Connecticut, it would be Marquette. Connecticut sits at number 4 right now, Marquette at 7, and Shaka Smart, it would not surprise me if he were the one to win the conference regular season championship. I think the Big East overall, they have the potential for 6, maybe even 7 tournament bids, depending on how the rest of this year goes. In the SEC, this one is really tough because I think there are 2 teams right at the top who are going to be competing all year for that regular season champion. But if I had to choose right now, I would choose Tennessee. Tennessee sits at number 5. They are 10-3 on the year, but they've won a handful of games in a row after losing 3 in a row. But the other team right up there with them would be Kentucky, who's number 6, has a win over North Carolina, and looks like either the best or the second best team in the SEC. I will give the slight edge to Tennessee right now, with a dark horse or a team that is right there being Kentucky. And I think overall the SEC probably gets 5 or 6 or maybe even more teams in. There are a lot of middle-of-the-pack teams in the SEC, which I think could surprise a lot of fans, including Ole Miss, including Auburn, Alabama, Arkansas. there's a couple teams in there to keep an eye on when this comes to a multi-bid league for the NCAA tournament. In the Big Ten, I didn't have to think very long about this one. I think it's Purdue, the number one team in the nation, and the team that I think is going to run away or be the most favored team to win a conference championship in Purdue. If I had to pick a team that I think could be spoiler or be the dark horse, it might be a little surprising, but I still have a lot of faith in Michigan State and Tom Izzo. Michigan State, again, is on the rise. They've won 5 games in a row. They are 9-5, but I see them as a team that if Purdue doesn't do it, watch out for Michigan State. And the Big Ten is a conference which overall I think will get 5 or 6 or maybe even more as the season goes on in the NCAA tournament. And then last but definitely not least is the Big 12, the best conference in the country and the conference that I struggled the most to try to decide who I think is going to win the conference. In the end, I decided on Houston. Houston still undefeated at 13-0, number 3 in the top 25. I think this is the year that Houston rises to the top in their first year in the Big 12 and knocks Kansas out of the top spot. But obviously, if Houston doesn't do it, I think Kansas is the other team to do it. And it wouldn't surprise me if at the end of the year, we had a tie for first with Houston and Kansas right there at the top. Overall, though, in the Big 12, I could see as many as 10 teams making it to the NCAA tournament. And it may not even take a winning conference record to get there. There are so many good teams. Every game is going to be an absolute barnstormer. It's just going to be so fun to watch in the Big 12 and incredible to keep an eye on. All right, so overall, those are the 32 conferences. Again, 18 that no matter what happens will get one bid. 7 where there's a dominant team, and if they don't win the conference, they might still get in. And then 7 conferences where at least 3, 4, or maybe even more teams get into the NCAA tournament. All right, well, you'll have to let me know if you agree with my list, if there's any teams out there that I did not choose as regular season conference champions that you think will be. And please feel free to make those comments if you have interest in that. But I really appreciate you listening to this week's episode, and we will continue looking more into conference play as we move into January. You all have a good rest of your day. Thank you for listening to the Press Play Podcast Network. To follow us on X, look up Press Play Pods. For sponsorship plans and more information, please email admin@pressplaypodcast.com. And to listen to all our shows and learn more about our network, please visit www.pressplaypodcasts.com.